In this economy, we sometimes have to be creative with cooking, especially when we are trying to be healthy and not live off of boxed food. A dollar doesn't stretch as far as it used to. Most of my recipes are use what you have recipes. So when I find a good deal on something, it's time to get creative. I found a great deal on chicken quarters a while back and knew what to do with them. They were $5 for a $10 bag, so I bought 3 of them. It was around Thanksgiving, so I'm guessing they had too many in stock while people were buying more turkey than chicken. You could also do this exact recipe with a whole turkey or turkey carcass. After Thanksgiving, stores often mark turkeys down so low that they are a steal. At this time, I was low on chicken broth and pounced on the deal. My plan for these chicken quarters was to make bone broth. Bone broth is a simple process that involves simmering bones for an extended period of time. I had recently bought a turkey oven and was itching to use it. Side note, every once in a while I'll find a turkey oven at the thrift store for a great deal. This one I found for $7. It was originally $14, but it was half price day, so I scooped that deal up and pull it out every time I need something that functions like a massive slow cooker. If you don't have a turkey oven, you can use a crock pot or simmer the bones on the stove for an extended period of time. Or you could just stop by your local thrift store and see what kind of deals they have. For these chicken quarters, I took a few minutes to cut off the drumsticks and what I could easily get off of the thigh meat. A lot of meat was still left on the bone. I could have taken the time to do a more thorough job of deboning the meat, or another option is to come back about an hour after simmering the bones. At that time, the meat will come off the bones much easier. However, I don't find as many uses for boiled meat and was too lazy to go through this process. So I just took what I could easily get. I threw these drumsticks into a Pyrex dish and the thigh meat into some vacuum seal bags. Of course, you could use regular Ziploc bags or freezer bags. This made 8 freezer meals ready to thaw out on a busy weekday to either throw in the oven or sear on the stovetop. Next, I threw the leftover bones and skin into the turkey oven with some water and aromatics I had on hand. A simple bone broth doesn't need anything special like aromatics, but they do make the broth more savory. This is a use what you have kind of situation. You can add carrots, onions, celery, garlic, bay leaf, peppercorns, parsley, or other seasonings. I know some people will save up leftover scraps in their freezer until they make a batch of vegetable broth or bone broth and use them then. I've tried this in the past, but it hasn't ever turned out well for me. It usually has a bitter flavor, so I'm not exactly sure what I'm doing wrong. As far as the salt goes, I usually err on the side of too little. This way, when I'm using the broth in meals later, I can add my own salt then. This just gives me more control over the situation. For example, if I'm using it in a Chinese-inspired dish that already has lots of sodium in the form of soy sauce, then I won't need to add any additional salt to the broth. Let the bones simmer for at least 12 hours. I'm pretty sure I did mine for 24 hours. Don't go too much more than 24 hours or your bones will start to dissolve and you will have a hard time separating them. Next, strain the bones out and let the broth cool. I usually put mine in the fridge overnight so I can scrape off the fat that floats to the top. Note that the broth might set up into a gelatinous blob. This is actually a good thing and just means you have a more concentrated broth with lots of healthy collagen. Now this is where I might lose some of you, but this is a waste not, want not kind of tutorial. With the chicken fat, I put it into ice cube trays and freeze it. I aim for about half an ice cube full. A full ice cube is too much when cooking, but do what you think you can use. After frozen, I pop them out and store in a Ziploc bag in the freezer. I use this for sauteing vegetables or anything that needs a little extra flavor. If the chicken fat didn't lose you, then this next one is probably going to lose you. Did anyone watch The Magic School Bus when they were a kid? Miss Frizzle's mantra was, "Take chances, make mistakes, get messy." This prompted experimental learning, encouraging students to embrace errors as part of the education process. As a kid, I took that mantra to heart and live by it every day. It highlights that active exploration and overcoming mistakes lead to growth and understanding. With that being said, cooking and gardening is all about experimenting, making mistakes, and learning new concepts. Each region has different soil and weather conditions. What works for one person doesn't necessarily work for everyone, and thus I am always trying new things and experimenting in the garden. My parents only live about 10 minutes away from me, and we can have very different experiences. I live at the bottom of a hill, they live on the top of a hill. I live in a neighborhood on the edge of the city, and they live in the middle of a cornfield. Even with such subtle differences, we have had completely different outcomes with some plants. My parents' garden is more likely to catch herbicide drift and has more wind gusts. My garden catches more water at the bottom of a hill, which isn't always the best for plants that don't like wet feet. With all that being said, I'm going to do an experiment with these bones by storing them in the freezer and saving them for the spring when I plant my tomatoes. See, Native Americans historically buried fish or fish scraps, including bones, beneath crops like corn, beans, and squash to act as a powerful, slow-release fertilizer. Plants are constantly feeding off the soil, so we need to replenish the nutrients that we take out year after year. When we don't take into consideration these nutrient deficiencies, we end up with unhealthy plants that are more susceptible to disease and pest pressure. I don't have fish scraps, but chicken bones should work the same. So in true Miss Frizzle style, I will be taking a chance, but hopefully not making a mistake. And at the very least, I'll be keeping some kitchen scraps out of the landfill. I've also seen some people dry out bones and grind them up and use them as bone meal, but that seems like a lot more work when I can just freeze them and save them for the spring. Now you may ask why I'm not putting them directly into the compost bin. A good rule to follow is to keep animal products such as meat, milk, eggs, and anything fatty or oily out of the compost. These materials tend to rot and can attract rodents. Once I have boiled my bones for several hours and strained the broth, I am using my electric pressure canner to make it shelf stable. If you don't have a pressure canner, you can freeze chicken broth in freezer bags or wide-mouth jars. If you're going to use jars, make sure that you don't fill your jars all the way or they will crack. It is also recommended to use wide-mouth jars so that when the liquid expands, it has room to slide up the edge of the jar without hitting a narrow neck, resulting in a cracked jar. I usually avoid freezing jars, but it can be done. If you choose to use a Ziploc bag, make sure to place it in a bowl when thawing. Freezing usually ends up creating a hole or two in the bag, so you'll want to keep this in mind so that you don't end up with a puddle of broth all over your refrigerator when thawing. Another thing to consider is using USDA approved canning methods and times when canning. Don't. I repeat, don't trust anything you see on social media, including myself, just because someone says it's safe. Make sure you compare with the USDA or other scientifically tested methods. The USDA has tested pressure, cooking times, and temperatures to ensure you don't poison yourself or your family. There are two types of canning that you will hear about when home preserving. One is water bath canning, which is meant for highly acidic foods like tomatoes, apples, and several other foods. Jars are boiled in water for a specific amount of time to kill certain pathogens. Chicken broth cannot be safely stored this way because it is not acidic enough. The second type of canning is pressure canning. For this method, you need an actual pot made for pressure canning. It has a gauge that will measure the amount of pressure that's being exerted. Pressure cookers work by using a sealed pot to trap steam generated from boiling liquid, which increases the internal pressure and temperature. This pressure raises the water's boiling point to about 250 degrees Fahrenheit. Some rebel canners will say that you can skip the pressure canner by increasing the time of boiling to ensure all pathogens are killed, but this is not necessarily true. Boiling water can only reach temperatures of around 212 degrees Fahrenheit. The first time I heard this, I had to confirm it with a thermometer because logically more heat on a pot seems like you would get a higher temperature. But once water reaches a boiling point, it will not get hotter because the energy goes into turning liquid water into steam. Botulism spores and other foodborne illness requires temperatures of 240 to 250 degrees Fahrenheit to be destroyed, which can only be achieved through a pressure canner. Boiling jars for a longer time will not kill botulism spores because it never reaches a high enough temperature. Bone broth provides several potential health benefits primarily related to gut health, bone metabolism, and musculoskeletal support. Gut barrier function appears to be a key benefit. Bone broth contains amino acids and minerals, including calcium, phosphorus, potassium, magnesium, and zinc, that enhance intestinal barrier integrity, reducing intestinal permeability, and alleviating inflammation. These properties may be particularly relevant for maintaining remission in inflammatory bowel disease. Bone health benefits are supported by multiple mechanisms. Bone broth is thought to improve bone mineral density and bone volume. The overall protein content contributes to musculoskeletal health by providing essential amino acids for bone matrix formation and stimulating insulin-like growth factor 1, which promotes bone growth and calcium absorption. And just like that, I now have 6 pints and 2 quart jars of bone broth, 8 freezer meals, and a bag full of fat for adding extra flavor to food, and some experimental fertilizer for my plants. All that for $15.